The following news flash is brought to you by the Lone Star Lowdown. Markets for Monday, the 16th of May, 2016, are currently trading with gold at $1,272.20 an ounce, silver $17.12 an ounce, Texas crude $46.21 a barrel, and Bitcoin is currently sitting at about 458 U.S. currency. Today in history, the year 1918. The Sedition Act is passed by U.S. Congress, making criticism of the government an imprisonable offense. An expansion of the Espionage Act of 1917, it banned speech and the expression of opinion that cast the government or the war effort in a negative light, of course excused by the perceived interference with the sale of government bonds. The end of free speech in the U.S. during wartime. Today in history. In recent news, a Texas openly gay church pastor, Jordan Brown, wrote in a statement today that Whole Foods, the company, did nothing wrong. This after he back in April had requested a cake from the all-natural organic grocery store with the phrase "Love wins" on it, but then claimed that he received a cake with an added homophobic slur. Brown said in his statement today, quote, "I want to apologize to Whole Foods and its team members for questioning the company's commitment to its values, and especially the baker associate who I understand was put in a terrible position because of my actions. I apologize to the LGBT community for diverting attention from real issues. I also want to apologize to my partner, my family, my church family, and my attorney." Whole Foods filed a countersuit against Brown and hasn't stated whether it would drop the action now that Brown has dropped his frivolous lawsuit. The University of Miami has detected a radioactive isotope produced by nuclear reactors in Biscayne Bay, spiking at 200 times higher than the normal level at the Turkey Point nuclear power plant located just south of Miami, confirming suspicion that Turkey Point's aging canals are leaking into the nearby national park. South Miami Mayor Philip Stoddard, who is also a biological science professor at the Florida International University, told the Miami New Times, quote, "You would have to work hard to find a worse place to put a nuclear plant right between two national parks and subject to hurricanes and storm surge." Laura Reynolds, an environmental consultant who worked with the Tropical Audubon Society and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, which intends to file a lawsuit, stated that, quote, "We know now exactly where the pollution is coming from, and we have a tracer that shows it is in the national park. We are worried about the marine life there and the future of the Biscayne Bay." This leak comes only several months after New York Governor Andrew Cuomo acknowledged that the state's Indian Point nuclear facility was leaking tritium into the local groundwater. The Indian Point nuclear power plant is located on the Hudson River, approximately 25 miles north of New York City, and serves the electrical needs of an estimated 2 million people. This is Rick Brody with your lowdown for May 16th, 2016.
Good evening and welcome here on this Tuesday night, the 17th of May, 2016. It's time for INN World Report Radio. My name is Tom Kiley, and y'all have given me the great honor to bring this program to you on not just on Tuesday nights here, but also on Thursday nights on the great Logos Radio Network, 6 until 8 p.m. Central Time. And phone lines are open right now, the first half hour of the show. I'll get that out of the way so that you could maybe get to your phones and give me a ring while I'm telling you about tonight's program. 512-646-1984. Let me go hurl the switch here to turn on the phone lines. Okay, phone lines are on, so you can get right through. Nobody's on the line. Love to hear from you about anything and everything. And speaking of anything and everything, we've got, for the first time on the program tonight, I'm very excited to bring you Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. And I've got some very, very good friends here in New York who've been after me to get Dr. Farrell on the program for quite some time. And it turns out that the time is now. So we're going to be joined in about 30 minutes by Joseph P. Farrell. He's a very, very fascinating person, has a degree in, well, it's actually, I believe it's early Christianity, but we can check that out with Dr. Farrell when he joins us. I know that he knows a lot about the Orthodox Church, which will be also very interesting, as that is sort of, coming back to the fore in Russia anyway, and it seems to be having an interesting effect on things. You may notice that the Roman pontiff has gotten together with the Russian Orthodox, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. That is a rift that has happened about 1,000 years ago, which is being patched up. So interesting times, right? Interesting times. And patristics, it looks like. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, actually. That's the degree that he has from Oxford, no less. So we'll be talking with Dr. Farrell shortly. His website is Giza Death Star, GIZADATHSTAR, and .com. And he really has some fascinating historical and esoteric information there that he goes into. I'd like to talk with Dr. Farrell tonight about oligarchy, one of my pet peeves. And, I recently saw some work of his at a conference where he was talking about it as well. So I thought I'd reach out to him and have him on the show. So that's what's coming up. Anybody ever visit the website of Dr. Farrell, Joseph P. Farrell, or seen any of his many videos on YouTube, give us a call, 512-646-1984. On Thursday's show, our next show, we will be joined again by our man in Paris, our Irishman in Paris, for that matter, Gearóid Ó Colmain, who's a really, really good journalist, if you ask me. We had him on after those Paris attacks. He gave a very, very good description of things from a perspective I thought that we all needed to hear that was not that common. And he was talking about, the bigger picture, what's going on in Europe, big transformations, this weapons of mass migration, injecting tens and hundreds of thousands of Islamic refugees from the wars that the Anglo-American Zio oligarchs have created in the Middle East. It's not like these people are coming to Europe because of an act of God or a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake or anything. They're coming because of an act of the devil, if you ask me, incarnate in some of these capitals and, causing great disruption. And I think that, at first I thought with that situation, it was because the powers that be were not happy with the attitude of the European public. The European public was not embracing the idea that we should have boots on the ground and a no-fly zone and bombing Syria. So at first I thought maybe they're going to stick it up their nose and send a lot of these poor people who would probably much rather be at home were it not for the warmongers like Hillary Clinton, who wants to be president, who have visited great death and destruction on their homeland. I'm sure they would rather be at home in a peaceful setting where they're used to everything, where they have where they are in the majority as far as their religion and culture and customs and language and food and music and everything else goes. Who wants to be uprooted like that? But no, it's because of the evil empire messing with their state. So at first I thought they were shipping these people into Europe to get the Europeans to scream and say, hey, we don't want this. Let's solve the problem by doing what the Anglo-American Zio oligarchs want us to do and put boots on the ground and really just knock out the Assad regime when peace can then return to Syria. But no, I suspect now that it's a lot bigger than that, I think it's this entire globalist homogenization effort to break down national borders and national boundaries and national cultures and ethnicities and religions and everything else. I think it's a big step in that direction. It's a sort of a twofer. You get to wreck and destroy Syria, and at the same time, you get to further your globalist agenda. That's what it looks like to me. So anyhow, Gearóid spoke about that eloquently. He'll be with us on Thursday night. So that's where we are there. 512-646-1984. Give us a ring. Be happy to talk with you. And what else? Hey, I don't know if you've seen it or not. Now that Donald Trump is the presumptive nominee, as they call him, for the Republican Party, that means that, unless something really stupid happens, he'll have the nomination, which they don't. Obviously, it doesn't happen until it's made official at the convention in Cleveland coming up. But there was a great deal of talk about this could be the end of the Republican Party. They threw everything they could at him. They threw 16, 17 candidates at him, all seasoned politicians. All of them fell one by one. And the deal maker, the man who's not a politician, ended up dispatching all of them. That's a tremendous feat. More Republicans voted for Donald Trump in the primaries than have voted for any other Republican in history in the primaries. And still they tried to stop the guy. And there's all this smugness on the Democrat Party side. And that seems to be a little bit premature because now the Democratic Party is blowing up. Their coronation of Hillary Clinton is being ruined by Bernie Sanders and all the excitement and energy that his campaign is generating. And, Bernie was just supposed to be a figurehead to make it look like they had to have somebody run against Hillary, So they have one guy running against Hillary, and he and his supporters have taken it very seriously. And Hillary, of course, is a horrible, lousy, terrible candidate. But you don't have to be good when it's a rigged game. All right? But Bernie didn't get the memo that it's a rigged game. So he and his people are fighting for real, and she can't close the deal. She can't close the deal. Here we are at this late stage of the game. It's very embarrassing. Anyway, John's on the line in Texas, and I think this is Scottish John, who has not called in for a while, but you can be next. 512-646-1984. Would this be Scottish John on the line?
Yeah. How you doing, Tom?
Hey, man. I'm doing a lot better now. It's been a while since you've called into the to the program, and we've heard your dulcet tones on these airwaves.
Well, I just want to give other people a chance to call in. I don't want to monopolize your airtime.
Okay, I'll let you know next time if it gets to be monopolization. So don't worry about that.
All right. Well, listen, hey, I was listening to Nancy Pelosi earlier today, and she assures us that Donald Trump is not going to be the next president here. So following her logic, I think the thing to do is not vote for him, then he will be the president, yeah? Is that how her logic works?
It probably does because, Gnome Chomsky, as Webster Tarpley likes to call him, Gnome. No. The great leftist philosopher or whatever, who, really did a pretty good job, I think, back in the Vietnam era. But I think he's getting a little long in the tooth now. I just saw where he was on. He was on Amy Goodman's show, that flack. And he's saying that the Republican Party is on the verge of being like the worst ever anything that's ever happened to the human race. So it's Hitler. Maybe we finally found somebody who can supplant Hitler as the worst thing that ever happened.
Oh, God. Oh, what did you do?
Gnome Chomsky.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to like that guy, but I think I lost all my respect for him. He's not someone I pay a lot of attention to, although I was listening to him earlier today, but just his usual, smart sound and stuff. But
listen, Chomsky, today's Republican Party is a candidate for the most dangerous organization in human history. I repeat, Gnome Chomsky, forget about Hitler. He was a piker, okay? Forget about Hitler. It's today's Republican Party is a candidate for the most dangerous organization in human history, says Gnome Chomsky. Food fight. Trump is Hitler. Right? Zionists, who are they? Anyway, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make that. The most dangerous organization in human history,
Yeah. Well, you were talking about, just a moment ago there, you were talking about those, the immigrants or the refugees, whatever you want to call them, in Europe. You probably heard, Tom, that they elected a Muslim mayor in London there just last year.
Yeah, right. And he's become the big mouthpiece now for the big wag, I guess.
I don't know the guy. I'd never heard of him before. But I've just noticed over the past few days and listening to LBC Radio out of London, there's a lot of unrest there now. There's one part of London that I used to go to a lot. It had a very famous street market called Brick Lane, and it was a huge...
Oh, yeah, all the Indian restaurants, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there was a big Asian, Indian population in that part of town. And I always...
hold on right there. We got to take a break. Scottish John on with us, and Chris will be next.
You are listening to the Logos Radio Network. LogosRadioNetwork.com.
Good friends, welcome back. Exciting show tonight for the first time. Dr. Joseph P. Farrell will be joining us in about 15 minutes or so. I don't even know where to begin with Dr. Farrell. There's so much that he covers, and a very, very, very interesting historian He's got a degree in the early church, I believe, and we'll talk about that from Oxford of all places. So that's what's coming up. In the meantime, we got a couple of callers here. John's on the line, and then we're going to go to Chris. Let's go back to John. Hello, John. Are you there?
Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, so we're talking about this guy who's the mayor of London as opposed to the mayor of the city of London, which is a whole other kettle of rotten fish.
Yeah. Yeah, he's actually, I believe he was a Labour MP. I think his name is Sadiq Khan.
Okay.
As I say, I'd never heard of him before these elections popped up a couple of weeks ago. And of course, with him being a Muslim and given all the furore that's going on at the moment, it's a very controversial election. So we just need to see how it pans out.
I think he was speaking out against Donald Trump. And you know, it's like if you listen to these critics carefully, they're very, very misleading, deliberately so, if you ask me. Where, you know, Donald Trump hates all Muslims. Donald Trump doesn't want to let Muslims. And his point is no. If you listen to Donald Trump, if you go through one of his entire speeches, he repeats himself. No, we clearly don't have our act together with people coming from the Middle East, and therefore he proposes we stop immigration from the Middle East until we come up with a way to better vet these people. This is a hornet's nest that we've stirred up of people who avowedly want to, you know, bring down Western civilization, all the rest of it, you know, and whether they would ever be able to do that or not is anybody's guess, but I'm sure they wouldn't mind trying or dying trying, you know, and his point is, how do we, you know, why can't we better filter these people out? And until we can do that, maybe we ought to just take a pause. That's all he said. It's not, I don't like Muslims, or I don't want any Muslims coming, and on with the man. Same thing with Mexico and immigrants from Mexico.
All these muppets that are doing all these protesting at these meetings, they don't seem to grasp this. You know, they've got it. I hear what they're saying, and they're totally misquoting them. You know, and I'm not supporting the guy. Anyway, I've just got this one thing I want to tell you, Tom. Later,
sure.
On. I don't know if you heard about this on Sunday. You've heard of Manchester United Football Club over there?
Oh, yeah, it's one of the best in the world, right?
Yeah, they're the biggest football club in the world, yeah.
Yeah.
Sitting here listening to LBC Radio, and the news break came on, and the ground was evacuated because they found a suspicious device that looked like a bomb. Now, there was 75,000 people in the ground at the time.
Wow.
And I thought, my God, well, I just remembered something that I'd heard a few days earlier. The Manchester police were carrying out one of these drills, an anti-terror drill, for 3 days, Thursday, Friday, or probably been Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And this thing in Old Trafford football ground turned out to be an imitation pipe bomb that those stupid buggers left there. Can you believe that?
Yeah, most of these terror attacks are attended by a drill, oftentimes that mimic the attack either right before or during or both. The 7/7 attacks. I mean, no, you can't make this stuff up. They were doing an anti-terrorism drill on 7/7 in London at the same station at the same time.
Oh, I know.
Come on.
And in this case, I don't think they meant to leave it there. I think it was left accidentally. And the outcome of it was this bloody shenanigans they had on Sunday. I mean, the team that was visiting, they came from the very far southeast corner of England. I don't know how many fans would have travelled for the game. Probably a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand. But you imagine travelling all that way. It would have been about 300 miles they travelled.
I don't think they lose any sleep over it. I think they actually get off on manipulating the fear of the public at this point. I think they get off on it. I think it's almost like, hey, what can we make them do next?
Yeah.
Well, listen, John, I got Chris on the line, and I'd like to get to him. But, man, it's been a long time since you called. Call in more often, will you?
All right. Yes, dear. I will, dear. I'll call you.
And say hi to Kevin, the boys, back in the old sod.
Yeah, we'll do.
All right, great. Thank you very much. All right, Scottish John, let's go to Chris now. Good evening, Chris. Thank you for waiting. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Tom. I wanted to say something about the election.
Sure.
CNN did a poll a month or so ago with Trump, Hillary, and Gary Johnson, Libertarian. And Johnson polled 11% of the vote. Trump came in second, and Hillary came in first, which tells me that if the Green Party, which will be on all 50 states again, if they could get someone like a Gary Johnson, someone, who could also pretty much be sure of polling 10 or 15%, I think that could change everything. An election like that, and the person I would think would be the best would be Bernie Sanders. If he doesn't get the Democratic nomination, I bet the Greens would give him their nomination. They gave it to Ralph Nader years ago. And I would like to see that. I think it would shake up this whole thing so well if we had four parties running, all of them at least in the double digits.
Well, I think it's a great point. Yes, my crowd is abuzz with the possibility of Bernie Sanders running on the Green Party. His supporters are really angry, and they're getting screwed worse as every day goes by in this rigged system. Hillary Clinton can't close the deal. She's about ready to face the consummate deal maker in Donald Trump, and it's an embarrassment to her, and she just wants to be coronated. Now they're playing games. Did you see all the controversy about the Nevada convention?
Yeah, it's pretty small potato. I don't think that's the whole. I'm trying to look at the big. You've been teaching me to look for the big picture, so I haven't focused too much on.
Well, but I think this is the yin and the yang. This is the little spot inside the big picture. It is emblematic, if you ask me, of the big picture.
Well, explain that to me, because I read.
Sure. I think that
big picture thing.
Yeah, no, I think that the Nevada convention is just a microcosm of what's going on nationally. That if this was a fair fight, it would be neck and neck, and Bernie may even be ahead by now. There was 3 million voters in New York, Hillary's home state as a senator and where she lives, that were purged from the polls, independent voters. Okay? Lots of shenanigans going on. They're throwing in the kitchen sink. This could be the last gasp of this version of the oligarchy, and they're throwing in the kitchen sink. They threw it against Trump. It didn't work. And now they're throwing it against Bernie, and he still hangs on. And there's a lot of fired up young people.
Oh, yeah. I've given money to Sanders. I used to give it to Rand Paul, and he was my favorite. But I've been giving money to Sanders, and I think a lot of us are. Small contributions. I think he's got plenty of money.
Well, it's a beautiful thing that you just did and you told us about. I think that my vision that I've been preaching here on INN since 2002 of transpartisanship is really beginning to take shape. People are disgusted. They're voting the person, not the party anymore, and, for someone who could support a Republican like Ron Paul or a Democrat like Bernie Sanders, I think that's what we need to do. And until we can switch back and forth like that, they're going to run the table with this dog and pony show that they do, this phony baloney Coke Pepsi duopoly that they've got us jumping through hoops for.
Yeah, and if one of them, Hillary or Trump, can barely win, with 35% of the vote or something, that'll keep them alert to watch for what the people really want. In other words, one of them will probably end up winning it if it's not Sanders versus Trump, but they won't win by as much if there's a big green vote.
Let me tell you something. Trump could win big. He could win big because Hillary is a terribly flawed candidate who depends on being in the fight where the other fighter is pulling their punches, and Trump is not going to pull any punches. She's got a glass jaw. She's got a lot of problems, and she can crack right up if she gets a few solid hits. And I think the Democrats know it, and they may pull her out at the last minute if it looks like it's going to be a wipeout. They got the perfect excuse. They can say, there might be an indictment. We don't want to cloud the process. And you watch for them to stick the vice president in there at the last second, Joe Biden.
Yeah, it would be Biden. Or she could choose him as her vice president, and he might take it.
Has the U.S. government ever spied on you? What's the government up to anyway? You can find out the answers to these and other questions with the power of FOIA. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll be back in a moment to tell you more.
Privacy is under attack. When you give up data about yourself, you'll never get it back again. And once your privacy is gone, you'll find your freedoms will start to vanish too. So protect your rights, say no to surveillance, and keep your information to yourself. Privacy, it's worth hanging on to. This public service announcement is brought to you by StartPage.com, the private search engine alternative to Google, Yahoo, and Bing. Start over with StartPage.
The Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, gives you the right to obtain records from federal agencies. Making a FOIA request is easy, and it's usually free. Just write the agency with details about the specific information you want. Most agencies even accept FOIA requests by email or fax. You can request information about a wide range of government activities, unless the information is protected by an exemption or involves classified documents. And while the government is supposed to respond to your request within 20 working days, don't count on it. In my experience, most items take much longer. For more information about the FOIA process, visit www.foia.gov. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at catherinealbrecht.com.
You're listening to the Logos Radio Network at logosradionetwork.com.
good friends. Welcome back. Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio, every Tuesday and Thursday night here on the great Logos Radio Network. And it's a very exciting show tonight. It's always a great thing when we have a new guest on the program. And that is exactly what we have for you tonight. Dr. Joseph P. Farrell and friends of mine have been after me for quite some time to get this man on the show, and he is here with us right now. He's got an amazing website, GizaDeathStar.com, and there is all kinds of very, very interesting information, historical and esoterica as well, all sort of all mixed in, and he's got an amazing point of view. And I'm so happy to welcome Dr. Farrell to the program. Joseph, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Thomas. I appreciate it.
Well, can you just give us all just a little rundown about, where you're coming from and where you've come from and how you've put this really interesting, very, very sort of, there's a basket of really interesting information on your program, on your website. How did you get to this point, may we ask?
Well, I've always been interested in a lot of stuff. I'm the inveterate book reader. So, basically the website's a reflection of my personal interests. I've always been inclined to investigate esoterica and alternative histories and things of that nature. And I like to go back and forth between the public narrative, the conventional orthodoxies and alternative points of view, because I really think that in today's world, you can't put the pieces of the puzzle together without looking at both of them. I think they belong together, and I don't think there's enough of that out there. So that's basically where I'm coming from.
Actually, that's a very good. It's a very good description of what I I'm getting to know what you do, about what you do, and so forth. But also, you're absolutely right, and you're the historian here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a symptom of the human condition, isn't it? There's a group of predators who like to be up at the top, and they're a very small group. They have an incredibly inordinate amount of power, and one of the ways that they maintain that power is by hiding behind, the layers of the onion, whatever you want to call it, multiple veils, concentric rings, whatever you want to say. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. I crack up every year when Forbes magazine tries to give us the swill about the 100 wealthiest people in the world. And it's either, like Bill Gates or Carlos Slim, and it's like not a Rothschild or DuPont or Windsor in the list.
In the list, that's right.
It's crazy. And I have to explain to people, no. Bill Gates is the butler for Queen Elizabeth, all right? She's got more wealth hanging on the entry walls of Buckingham Palace than this guy's got, at all. She owns Canada, for Christ's sakes. She can and has recalled the Prime Minister of Canada, right?
Right. Well, the interesting thing about the very top of the oligarchy is that they've been very successful, in my opinion, in using very medieval ideas to cloak their wealth. If you look at things like the Ford Foundation or the various Rockefeller foundations, the Carnegie endowments, and certainly the House of Windsor itself, they're very successful in cloaking their wealth behind foundations. And if you look at what foundations really are, is they're kind of a revival of the medieval crusading orders like the Templars without the crusading part of it. Because if you look at the Templar order, it's essentially a foundation because it was an incredibly wealthy order. So in other words, the order itself as a kind of a chartered corporate entity, a nonprofit entity, had tremendous wealth, but the individual members of the order weren't allowed to own property. So this was a brilliantly bold stroke, because what this did is it created the opportunity for the accumulation of intergenerational capital that was under the influence and control of the order, but not necessarily connected directly to any of the powerful families that were sitting atop the order. So, it's a very medieval model that these people are following very successfully.
I think it's an example. There's a quote that I like. I like to put quotes at the end of my emails, and there's one I've been stuck on for many years now where, written laws are like spider webs. They will catch it as true the weak and the poor, but will be torn to pieces by the rich and the powerful. There are different laws. So in other words, the very idea of a charitable trust or foundation where a regular person doesn't own the property is fine. But when you get up in the gazillions, there's really what difference does it make? A and B, who's there to enforce whether or not that's abused or not, as if they treat it as if they really do own anything?
Well, precisely. The other interesting thing about the comparison between these medieval orders, like the Templars or like the Knights Hospitallers and the modern foundations, the trusts, is that the Templars specifically were set up to be an order that existed outside of the jurisdiction of local nations, of local barons, counts, dukes, and so on. They owed their obedience directly to the papacy. And what this meant, in effect, was that they were outside the taxation laws in those jurisdictions. So again, you had a perfect vehicle for the intergenerational accumulation of capital. You had it retained in the control of the families that set up the Templar Order. So, this is a very, very medieval thing. And they were successful in fobbing this idea off, as the latest, greatest progress in the 1930s and 40s when these foundations were set up.
And what king or baron is going to go against the Pope? I mean, after all,
exactly.
in those days, your legitimacy stemmed from the papal blessing of your, ascending to the throne, right? That's a pretty good. It's a nifty idea when you really get down to it. Well, this is great. I'm being edified already as we speak. I had never looked at it that way, and I think that's a fascinating connection from days gone by until the present.
Let me add something. I'm not the one that made the connection.
But you are with me. And that's all that counts.
Well, believe it or not, back in the 50s, when they had all of these strange congressional committees, we tend to think of
that actually did something, right?
Yeah, well, we tend to think of that as the McCarthy era, but in point of fact, you had a lot of congressional committees. Kefauver investigating the mafia, and House Un-American Activities Committee, and of course McCarthy and McClellan and McCarran, and all these people running their committees investigating this or that aspect of penetration and manipulation of the federal government. Well, one of the most unknown committees was the Reese Committee in the House. That was a committee set up to investigate the foundations. And there's a very interesting book. It's called Foundations, Their Source and Power. It was published by the chief counsel of that committee, a fellow by the name of Rene Wormser. And he's the one that actually drew the connection between the Templars and these foundations. He said, what we're looking at is something very medieval. So, it wasn't me that made the connection.
Right, but you're the historian who dug that up for us, so we didn't have to go do it ourselves, and so we thank you for that. and I think it is, it is fantastic. There's this incredible medieval dimension to what we're going through, and in fact, I feel like what is happening is the 21st century is just sort of stretching things a little too far, and things are breaking up. Now, I know that they have great plans, with transhumanism and all the rest of it, but it's just how far can you stretch? I think we've seen the limit of a medieval banking system. It's archaic, and it just can't handle all of this stuff. And it's stretching, it's snapping, it's breaking. Of course, they're famous for using chaos to introduce even more control. But how do you feel about that? This medieval system, it's been successful, sure, but how do you see it going forward?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and it's a very important one. And we could spend whole seminars addressing it, but there's something taking place right now in the modern world, and you essentially have two different philosophies that are, I think, at war with each other right now. Let's call one philosophy the New World Order globalist, Mr. Global crowd, the Rockefeller idea that the world is best governed by multinational corporations and enlightened, informed technocrats and bankers. Mr. Rockefeller has said this very bluntly and directly. So this is essentially the path that the West has been on, largely under American leadership since... All
right, we're going to leave it right there.
Sure.
We're just entering the path because we have to take a break. You can see already, friends, this is really, really great. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell.
Easy.
Good friends, welcome back. Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio, every Tuesday and Thursday night here on the Great Logos Radio Network. Now listen, for the first time on our show, we've got Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. GizaDeathStar.com is his website. And already in the very first segment, I am overwhelmed. This is, Dr. Farrell, you're getting right to the heart of the matter in a way that I really hope that we would. We're sort of picking oligarchy apart, that secret group of people up at the top of the pyramid and everything, and you're already giving us connections that make a great deal of sense, if you ask me, into how they've been around for so long and how they perpetuate themselves. So why don't we go right back to it?
Well, I was talking before the break about two different philosophies, basic philosophies, I think, that are in conflict right now, and it's manifesting itself financially and geopolitically. On the one hand, you have the global corporation crowd that, wants to put in their new world order of mega corporations running everything. And they speak oftentimes of the obsolescence of the nation state. And then you go across the pond over to Russia, to Mr. Putin's Russia, where they had their own post-Soviet experience with oligarchy that they have rejected. And if you listen to Mr. Putin's rhetoric and that of some of his top advisors, the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov and economics fellow by the name of Sergei Glaziev and so on and so forth, if you listen to these people, one of the things that they're critiquing is, number one, the idea of a unipolar world. Number two, being led by American hegemony. Number three, and dancing to the tune of mega corporations and out of control finance capitalism and so on and so forth. So they are directing a critique against this. They're talking about a multipolar world in which the nation state still retains sovereignty, still retains importance. This message is catching on. You hear it being echoed by Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. You see now the rise in Europe of backlash against the open borders policy, the refugees.
The Poles, right?
Yeah, and some of this is already beginning to focus on this whole idea of the obsolescence of the nation state. There's talk of reconsidering this. So I think what you're seeing from Russia is, okay, we can talk about corporations, but they're not going to be able to run everything. You still have to have a system of checks and balances in which the nation state is going to play a role. So yeah, oligarchy is the model that the West has been following for quite some time. And in the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 decades, this has become more and more apparent, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you see the West behaving in geopolitical ways that formerly would have been seen as just absolutely insane. Well, the reason that it is insanity is that the governments themselves are not really calling the shots. It's the high finance oligarchs that are calling the shots. So there's 2 big conflicts looming on the world stage. And I think the interesting thing that you mentioned here about alternative media and alternative networks is that they have really brought out this whole idea of a financial oligarchy that has been so well entrenched historically in the West that's now coming under review and critique. And so far, the problem with all oligarchies is, like all elites, they become self-entrenched. They box themselves in. They surround themselves with their own yes men so that they really become kind of calcified and incapable of thinking outside their own matrix, outside of their own box.
Can I ask you something about that? Because yes, and I've thought a great deal. I'm a philosopher of sorts myself, and I've thought a great deal about this. And can I float to you another dimension that I feel is very important here? Okay. Oftentimes, whether it's a corporation, Henry Ford, or an aristocracy, or an oligarchy, or so forth, you can usually, or a religion for that matter, you can usually trace start back to a very powerful individual, somebody who had a great idea, somebody who maybe deserved to make a lot of money because of their great idea and that sort of thing. And then the old expression, when you pass the family business on, to the second, third generation, that's when it starts to go nuts, and I feel like that a lot of this stuff, it morphs and it becomes the second, third, fourth, fifth generation. And all they care about now is, can they live up to grandpa's ability to raise the bottom line every year? And they're not smart like grandpa, so they got to get into more and more nefarious things to do it. Does that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, and I'll tell you why. I just had a book come out that's called Rotten to the Common Core. It's obviously about Common Core. But in the book, I address these financial oligarchs that were basically supplying the finances for the progressive education movement at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And, of course, the Rockefellers were heavily involved in the mix.
The Carnegies and the Rockefellers, right?
The Carnegies and the Rockefellers, right. And to some extent later on, you had the Ford Foundation involved in this as well. But one of the interesting things that I uncovered was that John D. Rockefeller decided to send his sons, Nelson and Lawrence and David and so on, to one of these progressive schools where they had thrown out the classical curriculum, the actual curriculum where you learn things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, for one of these newfangled educational experiments. And as a result of this, Nelson Rockefeller admitted later in life that he found great difficulty reading. He couldn't read a book and derive pleasure and information and education from it. Now, what this means, I think, over time, is that oligarchies become entrenched in the status quo and in preserving it, and therefore they become terribly uncreative. They become, like I said before, they become boxed in by their own preconceptions, and they therefore cannot think creatively. They've managed, in other words, to put it very bluntly, to dumb themselves down. And in the process of dumbing themselves down, they, by maintaining the control and influence that they have over domestic and foreign policy, start on all of these insane adventures, this great global experiment in having corporations run everything. Well, we've seen how well that's working out. In my opinion, it's been a colossal failure. We're jeopardizing
for everyone, but about 0.1%.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But in the process, we're creating a backlash against the whole system of alliances and friendships that we built up after World War II. I mean, my word, just look at Japan under Shinzo Abe. They are rearming in Japan. They are bucking Washington's displeasure at the fact that they're negotiating openly and directly with the Russians and concluding some very, very interesting deals. So the process of this insanity is really creating a backlash that I think is going to ultimately lead to the unraveling of this very world order that they have so carefully built up over the years. And they can,
and with China coming online as well as Russia now.
Bingo. Yeah.
Wow. Right.
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, Joseph, we're going to clearly have to have you back on soon. If you can come on next week, it'll be great. I'm already booked on Thursday night. But I mean, we can kaleidoscope all over the place here. It's just, there's so many fascinating things that you're opening up. I've discussed some of it on the show from my own perspective and thoughts. But for instance, let me give you on this notion. Now you bring up Japan, and let's throw Germany in there too. There's a famous expression: "To the victor go the spoils." Right. How come nobody's ever applied that to World War II? As if it didn't happen. I mean, could we say that writing the German and Japanese constitutions and setting up their banking system and their governments and everything else were among the spoils?
Well, sadly, the fact is that I think, particularly in Germany's case, you have a very, very wide gulf, let's put it that way, between the public orthodox standard history narrative of what happened and what is the reality. Many of my books deal with what I've been calling the post-war Nazi international. And let me explain what I mean by this. I don't mean a bunch of Nazis wearing grass skirts, huddling in grass huts in the Amazon basin, hiding out from justice. I do mean that it is a well-organized, well-oiled, post-war extraterritorial state, if you will, with deep financial pockets, with an organizational intelligence branch with deep connections to the criminal underworld, the international drug trade, and so on and so forth, with deep historical connections to radical Islam. I just finished a book where I detail the fact that the favorite banker of the bin Laden family, which was persuaded to bank through, guess what, Deutsche Bank, was in fact a Nazi in Switzerland that managed all the post-war Nazi accounts, was the personal executor of Joseph Goebbels' will, was responsible for the financing of the Nazi rat lines out of Europe, was responsible for the financing of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, was responsible for bankrolling the 1970s terrorist summit in Barcelona, Spain, that included such luminaries as Yasser Arafat and a very famous SS commando living at the time by the name of Otto Skorzeny. This gentleman was deeply connected financially and ardent and avowed Nazi. So you're dealing with something that in reality is very, very different from what we've been taught.
Okay, hold that thought one second, because I'd like to ask you a question on all that. Okay, so what you just described, right, by conventional wisdom, ought to be somebody in some organization that is constantly on the run, looking over its shoulder because the Mossad is ready to drown it out. Right? And somehow I get the idea that that's not happening because they know, if you know about it, they know about it. And how can they coexist? I mean, that's is that an interesting question?
Well, they can coexist because let's put it this way. At the end of World War II, one of the most famous examples of this post-war Nazi influence.
We'll have to wait until we come right back at the top of the hour break we're going to have here at this. Okay, second segment only, and we're already getting into it with Dr. Joseph Farrell. We'll be right back with him just after this.
Soldiers of the bitter
All right, good friends, welcome back. Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio, every Tuesday and Thursday nights here on the great Logos Radio Network. Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, first time on the program. Apparently it's been long overdue because we've only talked with him for 2 segments already, and it's just like there's stuff flying out that it's hard for me to catch all of it. So clearly, Joseph, we're going to have you back on sooner rather than later. I'm asking you to check your schedule next week. I'm putting those 2 shows together, but this does happen from time to time. We get a guest that's been overdue, and then there's a bit of a backlog. So but very, very fascinating. GizaDeathStar.com if you want to go there, see the writings and videos and so forth of Dr. Farrell, many, many interesting subjects. And I really appreciate, Joseph, the way that it is so important because it's not what you see is what you get, especially the higher up the pyramid you go. You know, I mean, there's all these layers of obfuscation. And, you know, you can't even hear the O word, as I call it, oligarchy, even uttered in the media, you know, unless it's preceded with the word Russian.
Right.
So, and yet here it is. It's what's really running the show in our world and aspires to run the entire world. So there you have it. So right before the break, I think I'd posed a question. Yeah. Okay. I understand. Sure. They had a powerful organization, an important reason for that was because Wall Street loved the Nazis. No?
Yes, that's quite true.
Right.
But we have to look at several things really to be able to understand the depth and breadth of this organization. One of the clues that you're dealing with something that survives World War II and survives it intact is the deal that was worked out between the United States and the German Nazi general Reinhard Gehlen, who ran an organization during World War II called Fremde Heere Ost, which was German military intelligence on the Eastern Front. So in other words, you're dealing there with an organization that had its spies, its moles inside the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. The deal that was worked out, believe it or not, but it is absolutely a matter of fact in history. The deal that was worked out left that entire Nazi intelligence organization, some 4,000 agents, intact after World War II, with General Gehlen himself running it. And this was rolled into or under the umbrella of post-war American intelligence because by our way of thinking, we needed a human on-the-ground intelligence presence inside of the Soviet bloc. And
that's how they sold themselves, right? I mean,
that's how they sold themselves.
Exactly. That's how they sold themselves from going to the gallows, I think, right?
Right. And as a result of this, when President Truman signs the National Security Act into law in 1947, creating the NSA, the CIA, and so on, what this meant was that the actual on-the-ground intelligence and analysis for the entire Soviet bloc was in the hands of a Nazi intelligence organization, which incidentally was rolled into and later became the West German Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German version of the CIA. So in other words, historically and institutionally, modern West German intelligence is the creation of
continuity. Right?
Yeah, it's continuity.
Organizational continuity.
Exactly. And this is just one manifestation of this problem. So you raised the issue of the Mossad and all of these Nazis now.
Well, before we go there, okay, I'll just say that, yes, this has been a subject on my radar for a great long time. Christopher Simpson's 1988 book, Blowback.
Right, exactly.
What's your opinion of that book?
It's an excellent book. And if anything, it doesn't even dig deeply enough.
Right.
He points out that Gehlen's organization, was providing the military threat assessment analysis for the Soviet bloc for President Truman. And in some cases, it was so bad that the CIA simply typed up his analyses on CIA stationery without further comment and analysis and just handed them to President Truman. So in other words, the end result is we have a Nazi general briefing President Truman who's formulating and forming post-war American foreign policy for the Soviet Union. And this is being done by Nazis.
And I want to return to this question about the Mossad in a second, but this is a whole nother can of worms. And by the way, it was the first Blowback book, not the Chalmers Johnson one, which we did have Chalmers Johnson on. May he rest in peace on INN when that book did come out. I've yet to have actually Christopher Simpson on. I've been in brief discussions with him. But this, among other things, in that fascinating book of his, he points out where these Gehlen Nazis are actually facilitating, they're trying to purge the American system of liberals and people who might be against them.
Yes.
They don't get very far at first. Their stuff is laughed at, the dossiers that they compile on people in the State Department and so forth in the intelligence services. But then they're resurrected by McCarthy. So you've got a situation, right? You've got a situation where Nazis who were being fought by patriotic Americans in Europe and who maybe got wounded by them. Meanwhile, in the 50s, back here in the States, it's the Nazis who are purging them out of the government through McCarthy.
Yes,
is that crazy or what?
It's not crazy. It's actually yet another indicator of the extent and power and influence of this post-war Nazi international. And the intelligence, let me be very specific here. The intelligence aspect of this post-war organization is only one aspect and not even the major aspect. What I've uncovered in my books is that you found the Nazis in Latin America in particular in the immediate post-war period continuing some of their secret advanced research projects under the auspices of their host governments, in particular Argentina under Juan Perón. You had some very advanced fusion research projects taking place, being run by Nazi scientists, incidentally, in Argentina. You have, in addition to this, you have the whole post-war plan for Europe that the Nazis conceived of under the German economics minister in 1942 by the name of Walter Funk. And if you look at this plan, it was actually a joint study of the Reichsbank and IG Farben, of all things, for post-war Europe. And what they intended to do, and if this sounds hauntingly familiar, it should, what they intended to do was to create a European federation that would be dominated by bureaucrats and regulators, bypassing the national legislatures and creating a common currency zone.
Wherein Germany was the most powerful player.
Bingo. And what do we have? The
angel of death, Merkel.
Yeah, the angel of death, Angela Merkel. Well, it's interesting. It's not even just simply a parallel of concept, because one of the key legal advisors in helping set up the earliest stages of the European Union was a German lawyer that was a top advisor to the post-war chancellors all the way from Konrad Adenauer up to Willy Brandt. And this guy's name was Dr. Walter Hallstein. Well, in point of fact, Dr. Walter Hallstein was one of the principal Nazi legal theorists during the war, helping advise on how to set up a European Union with Germany in the driver's seat. And he's a principal legal advisor. They're signing the papers, creating the earliest beginnings of the European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community, later on the European Economic Union, and so on and so forth. So in other words, every detailed institutional aspect that you look at when you look at the European Union was worked out in this 1942 Nazi plan and has been put into place. Now, it doesn't take a German rocket scientist to figure out, well, if you've got Nazis making these kind of detailed plans at one end, and at the other end, out pops the European Union with detailed, close correspondences to those plans, that there might be some hidden Nazi influence at work here.
Well, there's no shortage of Greeks who will tell you that the EU is like the Nazis.
Yes, exactly.
To them. Well, maybe they know.
Maybe they know. They've lived under that system. So yeah, this is a measure of the power and influence of this organization. But the real icing on the cake for me was during the crisis in the Ukraine, when you had Russia denying that it was involved in any way militarily in the Ukraine. And let's face it, folks, if Russia was involved militarily with the Ukraine, it would be over by now. So,
Not only that, but it would be, the satellite imagery would be burned into everybody's consciousness as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you had during the Ukrainian crisis a top economic advisor for President Putin, a fellow by the name of Sergei Glaziev, wrote an extended op-ed piece for some publication. I think it may have been Global Research News or something like that. An extended op-ed piece, very well considered, very well argued, very thorough. And in this piece, he comes right out and says that Moscow's problem is not the Nazis in Kiev, and these are his words. I'm not making this up. Is not the Nazis in Kiev, but the Nazis in Washington.
Well, you brought us right there, because in that same Christopher Simpson book, I became aware of keeping the faith alive in the Ukraine by us spiriting all of the Ukrainian Nazis back who washed back to Germany with the Wehrmacht, and also then on top of that, Dr. Tarpley's work on the creation of the Ukraine in the first place through World War I and so forth, keeping that hope alive and so forth. So here you go, you're going right into all of that. So I wanted to ask you about the Maidan and resurrecting all that, and here we go, and how Russia is dealing with that. Very fascinating. I've heard that one of the big plums of this operation was going to be snatching the Crimea so as to deprive Russia of a warm water port. Boy, that didn't work out, did it?
No, it didn't work out at all. The idea that the Crimea was never going to be allowed to go to Russia is just absurd. This again is a measure of the insanity and wishful thinking that you have taking place at the top levels of the Western oligarchy, and particularly in terms of their strategic planning. Anyone could have told them that this was simply not going to happen. And the Crimeans themselves, the whole point of the Crimea was that Khrushchev made it a part of the Ukraine during
gifted it to them. No elections, nothing. Now, was he actually Ukrainian himself, as I've heard, or Khrushchev?
Khrushchev was actually the commissar that dealt with the Ukraine during the Soviet pogroms and collectivization of the kulaks under Stalin in the 1920s. It was actually Nikita Khrushchev who was one of the top commissars that was appointed to carry all this out.
The Holodomor and all that history.
Right.
Which I understand was also quite overblown by Hearst. And there was actually a legitimate famine going on in a lot more than just the Crimea at the time. I mean, more than Ukraine. But anyway, hold on. We only got 5 seconds. Friends, here we go. That was only the third segment. We've got 3 more to go with Dr. Joseph.
This is the Logos Radio Network.
All right, good friends, welcome back. Now, long overdue, Dr. Joseph Farrell, and we're going to go into his doctorate in a little bit, I hope. If not, we've already been in discussions. Next week is probably not a good week, but hopefully the week after we will have Dr. Farrell back on with us, because clearly we're just getting started here and there's a lot to go into. Dr. Farrell, I sort of interrupted you because we started to talk about the Ukraine, but the pregnant pause, the question in the air is still, and by the way, I'll tie it right back into the Ukraine again. Victoria Nuland, right, running the show in the Ukraine, she's a Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this insanity, or at least, I'm sorry, it's not insanity clearly because it's happening. So, by the conventional wisdom, it's insanity of Zionists prying open the crypt and letting the Nazis fly out in the heart of Europe where they did so much damage during the Second World War. How does that work? Why isn't Netanyahu and company screaming, where's the Anti-Defamation League? Where is the Simon Wiesenthal Institute screaming at the top of their lungs? What's going on here? The Nazis are out of the crypt in the Ukraine where they did so much damage in the first place. And who's prying the crypt open but Zionists? What the hell is that all about?
Well, my guess is that you'd have to go back again to the World War II era and in the years immediately prior to the war. And this is something that Christopher Simpson brings out in his book Blowback. I think it's on page 252, where he talks about the fact that the SS, under Reinhard Heydrich, no less, had concluded a deal with Zionist activists like Feivel Polkus and the organization Haganah and so on, these virulently Zionist and virulently guerrilla organizations, to train them on German soil in SS camps to go into the British Mandate of Palestine and wreak havoc and create chaos for the eventual establishment of a Zionist state. So in other words, you have a nexus between Nazism in its most occult black form in the SS and Zionism, with the Nazis training these people.
For the purpose of, the SS is doing this for the purpose of?
For the purpose of creating this eventual Zionist state in Palestine, and thereby creating a place that they can move all the Jews of Europe.
So as to get rid of the Jews.
Right. You've got basically a common approach. And there's another interesting book that your listeners may be interested in. This was a book that was published by the well-known Jewish playwright Ben Hecht. He was oftentimes a screenwriter for Rod Serling's Twilight Zone and so on and so forth back in the day. He wrote a book on a little-known case that appeared before the Israeli Supreme Court in 1955 of a Dr. Rudolf Kastner, Kastner, who had been seen by an elderly Jewish woman and fingered as one of the Zionist activists that was helping Adolf Eichmann round up Jews in Hungary and ship them off to Auschwitz. And he painted himself as, a great patron and hero of the Jewish state, when in fact he was one of the Zionists that were active in helping round up these people.
Sort of like a George Soros.
Yeah, kind of like a
young George Soros.
Right. This case caused quite a scandal in Israel at the time, and Ben Hecht wrote up a kind of a treatment of this whole case in this book that he wrote called Perfidy. So if you're not familiar with that book, it's an eye-opening look at this Zionist-Nazi connection that Christopher Simpson writes about in Blowback, and kind of brings it up to speed to the post-war period.
Well, it's strange bedfellows is the term that comes to mind.
Right.
But all of this, right, depends on, oligarchy, as I understand it. Everybody wants to be the king. And in the old days, when you had actual monarchies, one person was the king. They had to have some reason for it. So God chose me, the divine right of kings, that sort of went by the wayside and went into eugenics and genetics and so forth. But still, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, your understanding of oligarchy is that, sometimes there's just too many powerful groups and no one person can be the tyrant or the dictator. Sort of like what you had in ancient Rome, where they decided to stop, the families decided to stop killing each other and sort of live in this, tension, between them. And maybe we can make out better if we cooperate. To me, that's the basis of oligarchy. But at the same time, when somebody's weak, there's an opportunity to knock one off and, acquire and so forth. Is that a good way of looking at the oligarchy? Dynamic tension, a sort of a honor among thieves, but, don't turn your back.
Well, yeah, the model I proposed for people to understand what's going on in the post-war world, particularly with the Western oligarchy, with the Western plutocratic class and so on, is first of all, they crawl into bed during and after the war with the mafia, with the criminal underground. They crawl into bed with the Nazis. So what you really have is you have the creation of a global mafia. And like all mafias, you've got the capos sitting at their conference tables, wearing their rings, sipping their brandy, and smoking their cigars, and talking how they're going to divvy up the world.
In other words, the what do you call it? The Dutch, the hotel, the Bilderbergs.
Yeah, the Bilderberg. You have a mafia. And while they're sitting around talking about how they're going to carve up the world, each capo wants to be in the dominant position at the end of it. So they can cooperate with each other, and they can also go to war with each other. So in other words, this is not an overarching conspiracy theory, because it's very important to note that each faction will have its own geopolitical interests, each faction will have its own financial interests, and when those interests come into conflict, or when they're nearing a goal where they can acquire some control or influence over a certain segment of the global power structures, that's when they go to war with each other. And I do think that if you look at events closely in the last couple of decades, you can see little signs, little indicators that there are huge cracks and fissures in this new world order structure, in this globalist structure, because the factions are beginning to fight each other.
Well, and that's exactly why I asked you to come on the show. And I'd love to go into that. But before we do, since you bring up the wet work, okay, the criminal element. The low-level criminal element, because the whole thing is criminal as far as I'm concerned. But
right.
when you control the law, then it doesn't apply. But the mafia, okay, and even that has its PR machine to keep our eyes off of certain elements of it.
Right.
You say the mafia to people, and they think these greasy Italians who came from Sicily, and I've visited Sicily several times. I love the place. I'm actually half my family's from there, but I understand the origins of it and so forth. But there's the Jewish mafia also, which we don't really hear a lot about, especially in Chicago, I'm told. And there's anti-Semites that like to try to say they're the ones running the show in Israel and everything else. How does when you say the mafia, how do you integrate those people with the pinky rings and the Rothschild wine sipping and all that stuff? And what about the Jewish mafia?
Well, I've already said how it's integrated. This is all a function of the implications of the deals that were made during and after World War II with the surviving elites of the Nazis, on the other side of the world, with the surviving elite in Japan, which we left in place. It's interesting to note. It's
They're talking about mafia, the Yakuza. That's a Yakuza country.
The Yakuza, the Zaibatsu, and the Imperial family, and all of those connections. You have all of these deals being made. You have American intelligence. You've got the Wall Street bankers. You've got the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd. The Dulles brothers, the John J. McCloys,
Brown brothers, Harriman,
Brown, all of that. They're all dipping their hands into the same pie. They're all networked with each other. And these would represent what I think are the factions that are beginning to go to war and split with each other. I think we're seeing huge signs that these fissures and cracks are beginning to appear publicly.
Well, that was actually, I saw you speaking about that on a YouTube video at one of your conference you were invited to not that long ago. And I said, that's it. That's how we can get started with Dr. Farrell. Because to me, I agree, and particularly, I mean, Russia coming back online. And, Russia's been vaccinated to a certain extent, hasn't it? It's dealt with these people. So it knows what it's up against. And then the Chinese. So why don't we talk about that when we get back right after this?
Radio frequency identification, or RFID, is a technology that tracks things at a distance. When the things being monitored are fish, there can be surprising results. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht, and I'll reveal the downside to shipping salmon in just a moment.
Your search engine is watching you, recording all your searches and creating a massive database of your personal information. That's creepy, but it doesn't have to be that way. Startpage.com is the world's most private search engine. Startpage doesn't store your IP address, make a record of your searches, or use tracking cookies, and they're third-party certified. If you don't like Big Brother spying on you, start over with Startpage. Great search results and total privacy. Startpage.com, the world's most private search engine.
Birds that eat salmon from the Columbia River are getting an unwanted side order of chips. Fish and game workers have been injecting salmon with RFID tags since 1986 as a way to track them as they navigate the river's maze of hydroelectric dams. Birds can't digest the glass-encapsulated chips, so they excrete them with their droppings. Ugh. Hundreds of thousands of the chips litter their nesting grounds, causing their island habitats to glisten in the sunlight. While the birds might find the glare annoying, they're reportedly not harmed by the scheme, but there's no word on how all that high-tech litter will get cleaned up or what impact it has on the environment. I'm Dr. Catherine Albrecht. More news and information at catherinealbrecht.com.
Trails. Live Free Speech Radio, LogosRadioNetwork.com.
Something wrong! Man, I swear something's wrong. Something's wrong! I don't think I'll be around here long.
All right, good friends, welcome back. Now, clearly, if you've been listening to the program, we're just getting started. We're just getting warmed up. Dr. Joseph P. Farrell is our guest for the first time on INN World Report, and I acknowledge, if there is such a word, well, we acknowledge that this has got to continue, but we're going to run out of time tonight. So we've got two more segments. GizaDeathStar.com is the website. Briefly, and Dr. Farrell, I think you had a term nefarium or something like that. I thought that was really cool. I mean, I like the word phantasmagoria myself, and it sort of sounded like a creepy version of that. But tell us a little bit about the website. Where's that name come from?
Well, that name comes from the first book I did in this very extended series of books that I've been writing on alternative topics, and that book was called The Giza Death Star. So it's named after the first book that got me started in all of this. Quite honestly, I didn't intend for this to become a full-time career, but it has. Uh-huh. So, I commemorate the fact that book kind of launched me in this whole process on the website.
And if we may get extremely metaphysical for a moment, because we've been sort of dabbling around the edges a little bit. Speaking of stars and all that sort of thing, and your cosmic war and all that, I see on your website. Very, very briefly, I'd like to return to what we were talking about. But I've studied Buddhist metaphysics for a long time with an incredibly great teacher, and that's given me a wonderful way of looking at this virtual reality system that we live in, if you will. And there's been so much talked about, 2012, it was going to be the end of the world, and the what do you call it? The calendar of the Aztecs and all that sort of thing. Yet I hear, something which, by the way, comports with Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, that what actually happened, in 2012 or at the end of 2012 is that in its oscillation up and down in a waveform, our universe, our galaxy, our solar system, hence our planet, has actually crossed the median point of our galaxy from having been under the median for a long time and is now on the ascendancy. And with that, supposedly comes all kinds of Age of Aquarius enlightenment type energy and awakening. Have you ever heard that? And B, if you have or you haven't, is that a fun way to look at things?
Well, yeah, I've heard it. I think it may or may not be fun. I do think it is very interesting that we are seeing something remarkable happen in Western cultures, and that is that people are waking up. The old oligarchical playbook isn't working, and they don't have any new plays. In other words, we're looking at a football team that goes out season after season and runs the same plays, and now all of a sudden they're not.
And they used to work season after season as well, right?
Right.
And something's changed.
And something has changed. And I think a large part of it is that there is now a critical mass of people that have realized that their institutions of government aren't working for them. They're working for the oligarchy, that their public narratives aren't working anymore for them. It took, let's just use a simple illustration here to illustrate that point. It took approximately 2 decades for the critiques and critics of the Kennedy assassination and the official Warren Report version of it to be overturned in the popular imagination and to gain enough traction that people would accord it enough respect to pay attention to it. It took a matter of mere months, if not even weeks, for the official narrative of 9/11 to be overturned. So the public is much more cynical. It's much more aware than it used to be. They can no longer come up with their blue ribbon panels and all of this nonsense and convince the public that the official narrative, howsoever many holes it may have, is actually a convincing narrative. It begins to fall apart almost as soon as they utter it. And I think that's a good thing.
If I may share with you, because I'm a philosopher myself, I just can't make a living at it, so I have to do other things. That's the last thing our society values, apparently. But at the same time, you just can't get it out of me. So I'm forced to look at things and come up with my own modeling. And frankly, Joseph, it's my opinion that if anybody walks up to you and proclaims that they can tell you what's happening, exactly what's happening,
right,
then don't listen to them, because
right,
it's impossible, because there's no exactness in the physical world, much less in history and everything else. So the best we can do is model, okay? Right. And come up with analogy and systems that, don't bother trying to explain it all, but give you a functional view of things and how to exist in it. Are we in agreement there?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So if I may share with you then, and I've given this a great deal of thought because I respect your opinion now, my model for a lot of this awakening that we have going on, it goes like this, that the orthodoxy has been, you can't even contemplate anything other than capitalism. It is the end all and be all, the pinnacle of human development. You're not allowed to contemplate anything else, right? So don't even bother. And it has its fits and starts, and just get used to it, because there's nothing better. The Great Depression, that's just par for the course. Don't worry about it. There's nothing better. Okay. And then comes right before the Great Depression, when the bankers bit off a lot more than they intended perhaps to chew in the circumstances, comes the Soviet revolution, Soviet communism. And I think that got out of hand, out of control of the banksters who were running it and so forth. And now for the first, they didn't have a Great Depression while the Western world was having one. Or if they were on their way to go from a third world country to a highly technological society. In my opinion, we called it the Red 30s. A lot of people said, hey, maybe there is something better. Of course, it hadn't had the opportunity to prove itself yet. And a lot of people wanted to try this communism thing. And the capitalist oligarchs, the plutocrats, freaked out and said, we got to do something to keep them all on the reservation. Let's throw them a bone. Let's show them that the capitalist system actually is better for them. You get Franklin Roosevelt in there, right? A member of the oligarchy, albeit perhaps low-level member. He saves capitalism. And the New Deal, World War II, my father was a veteran, and the GI Bill and the vaunted American middle class comes into being, the most amazing thing for most folks in human history. They didn't want to part with a penny in the first place. They didn't want Social Security, none of that stuff. They didn't want working rules. They didn't want schlubs going to college, buying houses, or any of that stuff. But they felt they were in a competition. Competition is evil, according to J.D. Rockefeller, right? Well, this is why, because now they have to give stuff up. So this is what happened. And there's a jujitsu that takes place. I'm sorry for the long explanation, but there's a jujitsu that takes place from the Red 30s. You go through World War II and you come out on the other side with this love of capitalism by the little guy, and they're virulently now anti-communist because the commies want to take it all away from you. They don't even have a damn pot. You've got 2 chickens now in yours, and that's the way it goes until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now they're rubbing their hands together and they're saying, all you freaking bastards out of the pool, okay? They're rolling it all back. without the competition, it's no longer necessary. You don't have any place to turn to. And this is the 21st century. I lived through all of this. I saw it happening. We thought this was evolution, not aberration. And nobody saw this coming, that it was ever going to be rolled back. And I think that's got an awful lot to do with this awakening. Does that model make any sense to you?
Well, it makes a bit of sense. Let me tell you why. I think the term capitalism is perhaps too general. I think what we're seeing as part of the reaction is the reaction to finance capital. In other words, to the idea that money is made not by investing in manufacture or equity. In other words, not investing in things that actually add value to the society at large, but rather in investing in paper instruments, which are then traded amongst the financial capital class itself, and they create paper fortunes.
Casino capitalism.
This idea of Wall Street with all of these derivatives now in the quadrillions of dollars, which exceed by several orders of magnitude the entire gross domestic product of the world. Well, that's a kind of insanity of its own. It's an unregulated, out-of-control finance capitalism, which is very, very different from the kind of entrepreneurial capitalism that we saw during and after World War II.
And back to what I said about the generations. We'll be right back with Joseph Farrell right after this. All right, good friends, welcome back. Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio. I'm absolutely thrilled to have been able to bring this program to you tonight. This was the appetizer course. We're going to be going to the preemie course maybe in about a week and a half or so. We're speaking with Dr. Joseph Farrell. His website, please go and take a look around, GizaDeathStar.com. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Farrell. We only have one segment, but this is exactly what I wanted to talk about, nature of oligarchy and the changes that are going on. You really said something profound, or not profound, really amazing as far as I'm concerned. We could be at one of these moments right now where there's this big paradigm shift. Am I jaded in thinking that there's never a real paradigm shift, that the Babylonians or whoever you want to talk about only make it look like there is, and they keep, the Nagas, they keep continuing in a new form, they morph and they go, or is it really, are there really paradigm shifts where we can clean house and try to start something over again?
Well, yes, I do think that there are real paradigm shifts. I do think that the reason that the Babylonians, as you call them, have to morph is precisely because the paradigm shifts are real. In other words, they have to change their game. Otherwise, they're going to be left in the dust. It was an interesting observation. I think it was the late Roman Catholic Bishop Fulton Sheen that once observed that Western civilization, seems to go through these cyclical, dramatic paradigm shifts about once every 500 years. And he's actually right. It does seem to happen about once every 500 years, all the way back in history. If you look at what we're going through now, in my opinion, what you're looking at, Tom, is a paradigm shift, one of these cyclical changes that quantitatively and qualitatively is different and much larger than anything that humanity has been through in previous recorded history. And here's why. We are looking now, and I cover a lot of these stories on my website in the blogs. We're looking now at an astonishing set of things. We're looking at the Rockefeller foundations divesting themselves of their petroleum interests. We're looking at
that's new in the news lately. Yeah. That's amazing right there, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're looking at the Saudis talking about transitioning their economy off of oil.
Well, the Saudis going to jail with the 28 pages.
Yeah, and that too. We're looking at new energy technologies that are being now talked about openly and publicly. Lockheed, for example, a couple of years ago came out with a little commercial about their little fusion reactor that they want to mount on the back of a truck. We're looking at stories, in other words, that are indicating that there are huge changes coming in our energy supply. And I think this is being deliberately released as part of a controlled release. But at the same time, what this is an indicator is that the financial elite themselves realize that these changes are coming online. And why is this significant? It's significant because every system of finance throughout recorded human history has been part and parcel of a physical cosmology. And thus far, all the way back to ancient Sumeria, with that one exception, what has prevailed in the global financial system is a system of debt money, of monetized debt as money. And that means that the energy system, the basic cosmological physics, the basic philosophy that you had prevailing in the financial system was of a closed system and non-renewable energy sources. Now, the Sumerians, interestingly enough, had a kind of debt-free money that they used. And this was replaced at about 500 years BC. There's that 500-year landmark again, with systems of finance based on bullion, based on debt, and so on and so forth. We're now looking, I think, at a complete necessity for an entire global financial system reset because of these emergent technologies and the changes in the financial system that will inevitably accompany them. And what you see happening in response to this, I think, is you have a scramble on the part of the Western global elite in particular to keep their central warfare, welfare banking model relevant in that kind of system. Ultimately, philosophically, I think those two types of systems are mutually opposed. So whatever may emerge from this transition period, and it's going to be bumpy, there's no doubt about it, whatever's going to emerge as a financial system, as a system of international political order, is going to look far, far different from what we've been living under for the past 500 or so years.
Well, I think what you're saying makes sense because, as you say, the finances have been tied to material scarcity, okay, and gaming material scarcity. Are you a reader of Buckminster Fuller?
Yes, I'm familiar with him.
His famous quote that humanity is now on the verge of escaping material scarcity.
Yes.
And that in and of its, and by the way, when I was a young man growing up in the 50s and 60s, Buckminster Fuller was the future. He was the geodesic dome guy. He was the soccer ball guy, and he's been virtually wiped from the consciousness and replaced with all this claptrap about sustainability, man, sustainability, man, which really means, when you've got 60 people, it used to be 87 according to Oxfam, now it's 60, in possession of half the world's wealth. Any fool who talks about sustainability without addressing that is actually talking about how do you sustain that imbalance. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So and that's and they control that discussion, and these poor kids, they prey on their, decent emotion of preservation and so forth. Same thing, transgender, all the rest of it. I don't want to see people get hurt, but at the same time, even the birds in my backyard, you can tell the boy from the girl when you look at them. The cardinal's red and the female is gray. But anyway, back to. I'm not sure when you grew up, but when I grew up, atomic energy was being discussed. It was going to be too cheap to meter and all the rest of it. I went to the 64 World's Fair. We don't have World's Fairs anymore. We don't show people that bright future that we need to believe in to beat communism or anything like that. We are on the verge of material scarcity, and everyone who's had a vested interest in that must be rather insecure right now. Are you saying that they're seeing the handwriting on the wall and they realize that even they can't stop it, so they're jockeying for some sort of power on the other side of the transition?
I think that's part of it, but the other part of it, I think, is that they are trying to buy their way back into the loop. What I find very interesting is that the Rockefeller Foundations have invested in a certain fusion project in California. And I suspect that in the process of doing this, they're trying to do two things. They're trying, first of all, to do what you have suggested and continue their influence by buying into these types of
relevance,
projects. Right. But the other thing I think they're trying to do is to gain intelligence on what is actually out there by way of purchasing an interest in some of these ventures. In other words, that's a signal right there, along with their playbook of sustainability and all of this claptrap. What all of these things are suggesting to me is that they are admitting that they have boxed themselves into a cul-de-sac and now they're trying to get out of it. And they're trying to buy their way back into it. They're trying to buy their way back into the loop of these developments.
Well, I need to ask you a question as a point of clarification then, if you want to finish your immediate thought. But before you finish your thought if you like, but I have to ask you. Okay, fine. So there's these other schools of thought, okay, which is and listen, I get so many people trying to get me to get people on the show. Alien technology, aliens, all the rest of it. They already know all this stuff. They're suppressing it, okay? Why would the Rockefellers – first question is, if the aliens are so smart to come across the galaxy to get here, how can they let Rockefeller keep them quiet? You know what I mean?
Well, why do they keep – if they're smart enough to come across the galaxy, why do they keep crashing stuff on the planet for every person engineer?
Right. And they have all this great stuff. And how can Rockefeller keep their mouth shut? I don't get it. Just take over the world and get on TV, you know. But what do you think? And then I haven't read enough of your work, and I've seen Nazi UFO, all this kind of stuff. Are you one of the people who say the technology is there, it's being suppressed, or do you really feel by your statement they want to buy into this technology to get in on the ground floor, that it actually is becoming developed right now? In what school are you on that one?
Well, I'm not in either. It's a much more complex answer. I believe that what happened after World War II, to put it in a Cliff Notes version, and again,
you got 1 minute before the music. Go ahead.
The devil's in the detail. But basically, they set up a breakaway civilization that was investigating these technologies, and it's pulled away from the ostensible corporate controllers. That's the problem. In a nutshell.
And what are the manifestations? Certainly not Google, because they seem about as evil as anything. When are we going to actually see this coming out from under the covers?
Well, I think you're seeing it come out from under the covers. This is why I mentioned they're divesting from petroleum. This is why I'm mentioning all of these stories about fusion, Lockheed Martin's reactor, and so on. I think now you're seeing evidence come out into the public mainstream from established financial corporate institutions that this is a reality. It's been a slow drip, and it's increased to a trickle now.
And I'm a Fullerian. You know, I think, yes, I believe that humanity is on the verge of the overcoming material scarcity. And if you do achieve that, then it's a tremendous reset. I mean, how do you have people in control of this stuff? When I grew up, Joseph, my dad was an engineer, electrical engineer, and he said, you know, we're pondering what's humanity going to do with all this new free time?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. Well, listen, I want to really thank you for your work. We didn't even begin to get to Russia and the Orthodox Church, which I want to talk about. China coming back online, all of the rest. So we will have you back on at the earliest convenience for you.
Sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Farrell, GizaDeathStar.com. Thank you for your work, and thank you for one of the nicest programs I've had in a really, really long time.
Well, thanks for having me on, Tom. I appreciate it.
Very good. All right, friends. Gerardo Colme.